They slammed him against the hood of the squad car so hard that the metal sang. He did not shout. He did not beg. He simply stared at his reflection in the windshield, cracked and distorted, as if mocking the truth they refused to see. A judge, a man who signed warrants, weighed evidence, carved the law into verdicts. Yet to them, in that moment, he was only black. The city hummed with late afternoon traffic, oblivious to the storm brewing on the corner of 7th and Hill. People stopped, mouths half open, phones hesitating between recording and trembling in fear. The officers barked at him as if his very existence were a crime. He thought of the irony. Last week he had presided over a case condemning racial profiling. Now he lived its cruel theater firsthand, cast not as the arbiter of justice, but as its target. The older cop Sergeant Doyle pressed his knee against the man's back with a force meant not just to restrain, but to humiliate. His partner, younger and eager, gripped the man's wrists so tightly the veins swelled purple. They did not ask for ID. They did not listen when he said his name. They sneered. "Looks like we caught ourselves a dealer." The words dripped with practiced contempt. He remembered the morning in court, the marble echo of his footsteps, the way lawyers straightened at his approach. He remembered the respect, the silence that followed when he raised his gavel. Now he tasted grit against the car hood, his dignity traded for suspicion in a heartbeat. He closed his eyes, not in surrender, but in calculation. Every injustice had a witness, and this one vowed would echo louder than the crack of the gavel. The sun, low and merciless, painted everything in gold. It lit the sweat on his brow, the whites of the officer's clenched teeth, the trembling hands of the woman across the street clutching her child closer. To the city, this was another arrest. To him, it was an awakening. He felt the weight not of the knee on his back, but of centuries pressing down, generations silenced under the same boots, the same tone of voice, the same poisonous assumption. "Empty his pockets," Doyle ordered, and the young officer obeyed, tossing out his phone, his keys, his wallet. The badge card slipped free, embossed with the seal of the United States District Court. For a breathless moment, the younger cop froze, eyes darting between the card and the man's face. But Doyle snatched it away, scoffing. "Fake. They all think they're somebody." He pocketed it, sealing the insult with a sneer. The man Judge Nathaniel Carter felt anger simmer beneath his ribs, a controlled fire he had learned to master through years of listening to arguments, of withholding judgment until the right moment. This was no different. The courtroom had merely shifted. The streets were now the bench, and the jury was watching with their phones, their whispers, their gasps. He would not explode. He would remember. And when the moment came, he would deliver a verdict no one could ignore. The siren wailed as they shoved him into the back of the car, metal bars slicing his view into fragments. The city outside blurred into streaks of gold and shadow. His suit wrinkled, his tie skewed, yet his posture remained unbroken. He sat like a man preparing to hear testimony, to weigh evidence. Except this time, he was the testimony. His very body was the evidence of the system's rot. Inside the precinct, the fluorescent lights buzzed harshly, bleaching the warmth from the world. They threw him into a holding cell with the careless ease of men tossing trash into a bin. A young man in the corner, his dreadlocks matted, looked up and muttered, "What they get you for?" Carter only replied, "For existing." The cell erupted in bitter laughter, the kind born not of humor, but of survival. He leaned back against the cold concrete wall, listening to the clang of doors, the shuffle of chains. His mind sharpened, recording every detail: the absence of probable cause, the officer's refusal to read his rights, the slurs muttered under breath. He was not just enduring this. He was documenting it. Each moment would stand trial, and he would be both witness and judge. The hours dragged. His family had no idea where he was. His courtroom sat empty, but he felt no despair. Instead, he felt the slow burn of clarity, a reminder that justice was not marble halls and oak benches. It was fragile, messy, alive in the streets where truth bled and dignity was tested. Tonight, justice had been mocked. Tomorrow, it would roar. And as the golden light of dusk faded into night, Judge Carter promised himself one thing. They thought they had broken a man. In truth, they had summoned a reckoning. The night in the cell stretched on like an endless trial with no judge, no jury, only the cold indifference of concrete and steel. Each cough from the far corner echoed like a gavel strike. Each groan from another detainee reminded him that justice had long since abandoned these walls. The fluorescent lights never dimmed. They watched mercilessly, stripping away the dignity of darkness. Judge Nathaniel Carter kept his breathing steady, even when the sour stench of sweat and despair pressed against him. He closed his eyes and listened. In court, he had learned that silence often told louder truths than words. Here, the silence between clanging doors and muttered curses spoke volumes about a system addicted to power and blind to its own reflection. At midnight, Sergeant Doyle swaggered past the cell, his boots thumping the floor like declarations of ownership. He glanced inside, smirked, and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Another thug taken off the street. Sleep tight, boys." The laughter of other officers trailed behind him, hollow and cruel. Carter lifted his chin, refusing to shrink into shadow. His silence unsettled them more than rage would have. He understood power its games, its fragile ego. Doyle thought he had control. In truth, he had already handed Carter the script of his downfall. In the corner, a teenager whispered, "Man, why you so calm? They jammed you up bad." Carter looked at him, saw the fear buried under bravado. Because panic won't change truth. And truth, son, has a way of surfacing. The boy frowned, then nodded, as if memorizing a survival tactic he'd never been taught. At dawn, an officer barked names, unlocking cells for processing. Carter's name was not called. Hours bled together. No phone call, no lawyer. He was invisible by design. But invisibility was something he had studied his whole life. The way black men often disappeared into statistics, mugshots, headlines. He would not disappear quietly. By noon, the precinct buzzed with chatter. Phones rang, printers spat out reports, and the scent of stale coffee clung to every corner. Carter was yanked from the cell and dragged to an interrogation room. Two officers sat across from him, Doyle leaning in with that smug grin. "You got quite a mouth last night," Doyle said, "claiming you're some federal judge. Cute story." He slapped a folder onto the table, empty except for a blank form. "Here's how it works. You tell us who you're working with, where you got your stash, and maybe we cut you loose with just a fine." Carter stared at him, unblinking. "You made a mistake." Doyle chuckled. "The only mistake here is you thinking anyone cares about your little act." The younger officer shifted uneasily. He had seen the badge card, had felt the weight of doubt, but Doyle's authority pressed heavier than truth. Carter saw it in his eyes, the conflict of conscience. He stored it away. Even cracks in armor had their use. "Charge me or release me," Carter said, voice steady, each word sharpened like a verdict. Doyle slammed his fist on the table. "You don't give orders here." Silence thickened. The younger officer looked down, scribbling nonsense on a pad, avoiding eye contact. Doyle's rage filled the room. But Carter knew rage without reason was a fire that consumed itself. He remained composed, his stillness more threatening than defiance. After hours of stalemate, they dragged him back to the cell. The day stretched long, his mind replaying every detail. He imagined the courtroom tomorrow, lawyers waiting, cases piling up, whispers spreading about the absent judge. By then, his disappearance would raise questions. He clung to that timeline. Patience was his weapon. That evening, a rookie guard approached the cell quietly, slipping a folded note between the bars. Carter unfolded it discreetly. Inside were 3 words, "I believe you." No signature. His eyes flicked to the hallway. The younger officer from the interrogation leaned against the wall, face turned away. A seed had been planted. Even in corrupted soil, truth could root itself. By the 3rd day, Carter's absence was impossible to ignore. Local reporters sniffed around the courthouse, rumors buzzing. "Where's Judge Carter?" His clerks called his phone repeatedly, but it sat locked away in Doyle's pocket. Meanwhile, inside the cell, Carter became a quiet anchor. Other detainees, hardened by years of being ignored, began listening to him. He spoke little, but when he did, his words carried weight. He explained rights they never knew they had. He told them about cases he'd ruled on, injustices he'd fought against. He never revealed his identity outright, only painted enough to remind them that dignity was not a luxury, but a right. "Why you even here then?" one man asked bitterly. "Because sometimes," Carter answered, "the system trips over its own arrogance." That night, the precinct buzzed louder. A news report on the lobby television caught Doyle's attention. The anchor announced, "Federal Judge Nathaniel Carter missing since Monday." Colleagues raise alarm as authorities search for answers. Doyle's smirk faltered. The younger officer glanced at him, panic flickering across his face. Carter, from inside the cell, heard the report. He let the words settle like thunder. The courtroom had finally begun to stir. Doyle stormed back to the cell, rage barely contained. "Who the hell are you?" he hissed, gripping the bars. Carter stood slowly, meeting his eyes. "I told you 3 days ago. You just weren't ready to listen." The other detainees looked between them, realization dawning. Whispers spread like wildfire. Doyle cursed under his breath, storming away. In the early hours of the next morning, 2 men in suits arrived at the precinct. Federal marshals. Their presence sent ripples through the building. They carried authority no local badge could dismiss. Doyle tried to intercept them, spinning half-truths, but their expressions stayed stone cold. Carter was pulled from the cell at last, the marshal's respectful nods a stark contrast to the contempt he had endured. Doyle hovered nearby, sweat glistening, his arrogance crumbling under the weight of exposure. As they walked him out, Carter paused. He turned back to the detainees who pressed against the bars, eyes wide with a mix of awe and vindication. He raised his voice just enough for the man Doylito here. "This isn't over. Every voice in here matters, and I intend to make sure the world hears it." But freedom was not the end. It was the opening argument. The trial had only just begun. The courthouse lobby had never been so alive. By the time Judge Nathaniel Carter returned, escorted by marshals through the heavy glass doors, the place was flooded with voices. Reporters shouted questions that tangled over each other, their cameras flashing like lightning. Lawyers in suits froze mid-step, mouths falling open. Clerks whispered his name as if invoking a ghost. He walked steadily, back straight, every step a statement. His suit was rumpled, his tie skewed, but dignity radiated from him like the golden sunlight spilling through the atrium windows. For days he had been stripped of it. Now, in full view, he reclaimed it. A young reporter shouted, "Judge Carter, is it true the police arrested you without cause?" Another yelled, "Were you assaulted?" He stopped, turned slightly, and let his silence hang. He had spent his life weighing words carefully. Today, his restraint was the sharpest blade. Finally, he spoke. "The truth will be revealed where it always belongs, in the light." The marshals ushered him past the frenzy, but the seed had been planted. By evening, every news channel carried his image, a black federal judge allegedly brutalized by police. Commentators debated. Some called it a scandal. Others tried to cast doubt, muttering about misunderstandings. But the photographs of him leaving the precinct, flanked by marshals, told their own story. In neighborhoods across the city, televisions flickered in barbershops, diners, and crowded apartments. Young men saw themselves in his bruises. Mothers felt rage in their chests. Students filled online forums, sharing the story with hashtags that spread like wildfire. The narrative was no longer confined to one man. It belonged to a movement. Inside his chambers that night, Carter sat at his desk long after sunset. The room was lined with law books and case files, the smell of polished wood familiar, yet strangely foreign after days in a cell. His reflection stared back from the darkened window, older now, heavier, yet burning with resolve. He spread papers across his desk, reports on police misconduct, cases of unlawful arrests, statistics he had studied but now carried in his bones. For years, he had ruled on them with impartial distance. But distance had been ripped away. Now he understood in his flesh what the numbers failed to show. His clerk, Evelyn, knocked softly and entered. Her eyes glistened with relief and fury. "Judge, we've been frantic. No one could reach you. Are you?" "I'm alive," he interrupted gently. "That's enough for now." She hesitated, then asked, "What will you do?" He leaned back, folding his hands. "The law gives me one gavel. But life has given me something heavier, the truth of experience. I intend to use both." Meanwhile, across town, the police department scrambled. Press conferences were hastily arranged. The chief, red-faced and defensive, stood before cameras insisting it was all a misunderstanding. The officers involved believed they were acting in good faith, he claimed. But his words rang hollow. Reporters pressed. Why was Judge Carter denied a phone call? Why wasn't his ID acknowledged? The chief dodged, sweat glistening under the lights. Inside the precinct, Sergeant Doyle fumed. His reputation, once untouchable among the ranks, now trembled. The younger Officer Miller avoided his gaze, guilt gnawing at him. Doyle barked orders, trying to tighten control, but the whispers among his colleagues grew. Everyone knew this scandal would not fade quietly. Thousands gathered, holding signs painted in bold strokes. Justice for all. No more profiling. We believe Judge Carter. The golden sunlight bathed the crowd, turning cardboard into glowing declarations. Chants rose, unrelenting, echoing through the city streets. From his office window, Carter watched them. He did not see strangers. He saw witnesses, jurors, a nation ready for testimony. Their voices were not noise. They were evidence. He knew what had to come next. Not vengeance, not anger alone, but reckoning, structured, undeniable, carved into the framework of law. He began drafting motions, subpoenas, requests for records. Every detail from his arrest, every insult, every denial of rights was inked into formal language that would stand in court. Late at night, his son Daniel called. The boy's voice, usually confident at college, cracked with worry. "Dad, when I saw the news, I'm here, son," Carter reassured. "I'm here. But what if someone had, they didn't," Carter said firmly. "And because of that, I can fight for those who can't call home tonight." Silence stretched, then Daniel whispered, "I'm proud of you." Carter closed his eyes, the words cutting deeper than any wound. As the week unfolded, momentum surged. Civil rights lawyers volunteered, community leaders spoke, and even senators issued statements. The story was no longer a scandal. It was a mirror. America stared into it, uneasy at the reflection. In the precinct, the cracks widened. Officer Miller finally requested a private meeting with investigators. His conscience, once silenced by Doyle's authority, now screamed too loud to ignore. He confessed. The badge card was real. Doyle dismissed it. And everything afterward was deliberate humiliation. His testimony became a dagger aimed at Doyle's defense. News leaked quickly. Headlines blared. Officer confesses to cover up in Judge Carter arrest. The department's shield was crumbling. Doyle's rage turned desperate. He barked at colleagues, threatened Miller, and cursed Carter's name. But the walls were closing in. What he had thought was an ordinary abuse of power had become a national scandal. His arrogance had handed the system a case study of its own rot. Meanwhile, Carter prepared for the hearing. He stood in his chambers, robe hanging heavy on his shoulders, and thought about the symbolism. A black man in a judge's robe once invisible to the men who threw him against a car. Soon, he would face them again, not as their victim, but as their overseer. The irony was sharp, but he reminded himself, this was not about revenge. This was about a verdict larger than any one man. The morning of the disciplinary hearing arrived. Reporters swarmed the courthouse steps, their voices a storm. Protesters filled the sidewalks, chants rising in waves. Inside, the courtroom brimmed with lawyers, activists, and officials. The air was thick, electric, as if history itself was holding its breath. Judge Nathaniel Carter took his seat at the bench. Silence fell instantly. His gavel struck once, the sound echoing like thunder. "This court," he declared, voice steady and resonant, "is not merely convened to weigh the actions of two officers. It is here to confront a truth our nation has long ignored." The room leaned forward, caught in the gravity of his words. Carter's eyes swept over the crowd. He was not speaking only to the lawyers or the accused. He was speaking to a country watching through screens, to every person who had ever felt the same knee on their back. "The law is not blind," he continued. "It sees what we show it. And what we have shown, time and again, is that prejudice masquerades as justice until someone refuses to bow." Doyle sat at the defense table, sweat beading, jaw tight. Miller, on the witness stand, looked pale but resolute. He repeated what he had told investigators. The courtroom rippled with gasps. Doyle muttered curses under his breath, but Carter silenced him with a single look. As the hearing unfolded, evidence piled higher. Body cam footage mysteriously lost. Logs altered. Testimonies conflicted. Each revelation was another brick in the wall closing around Doyle and the department. By the end of the day, Carter knew the fight was far from finished. The machinery of justice moved slowly, and those with power resisted every inch. But momentum was on his side. The reckoning had begun. When he struck the gavel to adjourn, the golden sunlight slanted through the courtroom windows, catching the dust in the air, turning it into glittering fragments of light. He sat for a moment, watching it, remembering the golden beam that had struck him on the street as they dragged him away. That light had never left. It had only grown stronger. And now, it illuminated not just him, but a movement. The verdict was still to come. But the truth had already been spoken. The courthouse was a fortress of tension. Weeks had passed since the first hearing, yet the air still vibrated with urgency each time Judge Nathaniel Carter entered the chamber. Outside, the protests never stopped. Each day, crowds gathered, their chants blending into a heartbeat that echoed through the city. Inside, lawyers argued, witnesses testified, and every detail of his unlawful arrest was dissected. But what was on trial was larger than any single moment. It was the soul of the system itself. Reporters called it the Carter Reckoning. Pundits debated whether one case could truly change centuries of bias. Politicians fumbled with carefully crafted statements. But for the people watching, the mothers, fathers, sons, daughters who knew the sting of profiling, the trial was not theory. It was lived truth finally laid bare. On the fourth week, Sergeant Doyle finally took the stand. He carried himself with the same swagger he had worn the night of the arrest, but it faltered under the weight of eyes fixed on him. The room was packed. Activists, clergy, journalists, even fellow officers. His uniform looked less like authority and more like armor for a man cornered. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed black woman named Mariah Bennett, wasted no time. "Sergeant Doyle, did you or did you not see Judge Carter's federal identification card when you detained him?" He sneered, trying to mask unease. It was dark. Could have been fake. "These people," objection, Bennett snapped, cutting through his words like steel. "These people? Sergeant, we're talking about a federal judge. A man who has sworn the same oath you claim to uphold." The gallery murmured, the weight of Doyle's prejudice exposed in 3 careless words. Carter, seated at the bench, kept his face neutral, though inside he felt the sting of recognition. This was not about him alone. It was about every dismissal, every insult, every "these people" uttered by those who wore power like a weapon. Bennett pressed further. "You refused him a phone call, correct?" "I was following protocol," Doyle muttered. "Protocol? Or prejudice?" The silence that followed was louder than any gavel strike. Doyle's face flushed. His arrogance cracked, and for the first time, the room saw not a protector of law but a man stripped bare by his own hate. When cross-examination ended, Doyle sagged in the chair, sweat dampening his collar. The defense offered weak justifications, but the damage was done. Next came Officer Miller. His testimony was steady, voice shaking only when he described the moment he watched Doyle dismiss the judge's credentials. "I knew it was wrong," Miller admitted, "but I didn't stop it. I was afraid. Afraid of Doyle. Afraid of the system." His confession rippled through the chamber. Some scoffed at his cowardice. Others saw in him the mirror of every bystander who had remained silent in the face of injustice. Carter studied him carefully. Miller was both a failure and a possibility, proof that even within the rot, seeds of truth could grow if tended. As the days of testimony concluded, Carter prepared his remarks. He did not draft them as a judge typically would, bound by sterile phrasing. He wrote as a man who had felt the cold metal of a squad car against his cheek, as a citizen who had endured what too many endured unseen. His words would not be for the lawyers alone. They would be for the people outside chanting his name, for the mother holding her son tighter at night, for the officer debating whether to break his silence tomorrow. The day of final judgment arrived under a sky of blazing gold. Sunlight poured through the courthouse steps, illuminating the thousands gathered. Banners waved, drums beat, voices thundered. Justice now. Justice now. The crowd was no longer protest. It was prophecy. Inside, the chamber was silent as Carter took his seat. He looked over the assembly, faces tense, eyes wide, breaths held. Doyle sat at the defense table, defiant yet diminished. Miller sat nearby, pale but resolute. Bennett stood with quiet strength, ready to hear the verdict. Carter lifted his gavel. The weight of it pressed heavy in his hand. He remembered the night Doyle had slammed his fist on a table, thinking power was noise. True power, Carter knew, was silence held until the right moment. He struck once. The room froze. "This case," he began, voice calm yet commanding, is not about one arrest. It is not about one officer's pride or one man's humiliation. It is about a disease that has long infected the body of justice, the disease of prejudice disguised as authority. His words rolled through the chamber, deliberate and sharp. He recounted the facts: his unlawful detention, the denial of rights, the slurs muttered, the cover-up. He cited precedent, the Constitution, the promises carved into law but too often ignored. Then his tone shifted, rising with the rhythm of truth. When I was thrown against that squad car, I was not seen as a judge. I was not seen as a father, a husband, a citizen. I was seen only as a black man to be subdued. That blindness is not just Doyle's blindness. It is ours if we allow it. The law is meant to see all equally, yet it has too often closed its eyes when the victim is black, when the accused wears a badge. Murmurs spread through the room, some with tears, some with shame. Carter's gaze swept across them, landing finally on Doyle. Sergeant Doyle abused his authority. He acted not in ignorance, but in arrogance. And the system enabled him, as it has enabled too many for too long. Today, that ends here, in this courtroom. He struck the gavel again. Sergeant Doyle, you are found guilty of unlawful arrest, abuse of power, and violation of constitutional rights. You are hereby stripped of your badge, and this court recommends federal charges to follow. The gasp that followed shook the chamber. Doyle's face collapsed, rage and disbelief clashing in his eyes. The guard stepped forward, escorting him away. The swagger that once dripped from his every step was gone. He looked smaller now, a man consumed by the very system he thought he controlled. Carter turned his attention to Miller. Officer Miller, your silence enabled injustice. Yet your testimony broke it. The court finds you guilty of dereliction of duty, but it also recognizes your courage in speaking truth. You will face disciplinary action, but you are offered the chance to rebuild not as a cog of silence, but as a voice of change. Miller bowed his head, tears glistening. Finally, Carter addressed the room as a whole. This verdict is not the end. Justice cannot live in verdicts alone. It must live in our streets, in our precincts, in our hearts. Every time we choose silence in the face of hate, we choose injustice. But every time we choose to truly see each other, we strike a blow for freedom. The chamber erupted in applause, not the wild applause of entertainment, but the solemn applause of a people exhaling centuries of held breath. Outside, the crowd roared, their chants merging into a single, deafening cry of victory. Carter sat for a moment, letting it wash over him. The sunlight poured through the windows, bathing the chamber in gold. He thought of the moment on 7th and Hill, when that same golden light had caught him in the grip of hate. It had not abandoned him then, and it did not abandon him now. It was a reminder. Dignity could be assaulted but never erased. Later that evening, Carter walked out of the courthouse into the arms of the people. Reporters swarmed, microphones thrust forward, but he raised his hand, and the noise fell quiet. He spoke simply, not as a judge, but as a man. I was one. Today we are many. Tomorrow, we must be more. This fight is not finished, but together, it is winnable. The crowd erupted once more, their voices rising into the golden sky. Carter looked at their faces, young and old, black and white, weary and hopeful, and he felt the truth settle deep in his bones. The system had tried to break him. Instead, it had built a movement. And in that moment, beneath the glow of a setting sun, Judge Nathaniel Carter knew. Justice, though wounded, still breathed. And as long as it breathed, so would he. Thank you for listening. If you find it interesting, please like and subscribe to follow the next stories.